Hello and welcome as we come now, technically, to the second week of the common time of the church year. And the readings this time, the first comes again from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 62, verses 1 through 5. We have a beginning of some selections from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, but we jump right away to one of the middle part of his letter, namely chapter 12, verses 4 through 11. And the gospel this time comes from the gospel according to John, chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Now, as we mentioned last time, there are traditionally in our celebration of the Epiphany, or the manifestation of Jesus, three events that are recorded or remembered. First being the visit of the Magi, the second being the baptism of Jesus by John in the Jordan, and the third, which is the one we look at this time, is the first sign, or first miracle, if you want, of Jesus. So this time, this year of Luke, though the gospel is not from Luke, spreads out these three mysteries, or three events, or three firsts, if you want, in the story of Jesus over 3 weeks. See, the first recognition of Jesus as the King, as the Savior by the Magi, the first recognition of Jesus when he is baptized. "This is my beloved Son," says the voice out of the heavens, "in whom I am well pleased." And this time, the first sign of Jesus as certainly divine, but also as the messenger of God. Let's give a little bit of a background here to the gospel tradition of John. We have mentioned on many occasions, this was particularly the case with regard to the first gospel, Mark, which was quite short, that John was also often a filler. But this time, the story is remembered because it is part, as I've mentioned, of this manifestation of Jesus, presence as the sign and wonder of God. Now, the opening chapters, and so because we have this opportunity, we'll do a little bit of a background of how the gospel tradition of John begins its message. It is very different from that which was used by the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, and there's an argument made and among the scholars as to what degree the gospel writer John was dependent on or knew about the synoptic tradition. As you will remember, the Gospel of John is written sometime between the year 90 and extended by some thinkers as well into the 2nd century, the year 120. But the common time frame for the gospel tradition of John is somewhere in the 90s, and so let's say the beginning of the 90s. But if one thinks about it, this gospel is written some 60 years or better after the actual time of Jesus. And among the gospel traditions, the fourth gospel has Jesus speaking more than in the others, well, not put together, but certainly much less do they have Jesus giving talks or speeches. Now, in the episode we're looking this time, there is not a great deal of Jesus speaking. There are a number of frameworks for interpreting the gospel tradition here. What I would like to suggest is one of the viewpoints that is held by some scholars is that the gospel writer begins the story of Jesus by a great new day. Now, if one thinks about it, in a week, there are 7 days. And so if you're going to come to a new day, it would not be the first, but it would be, well, what in the biblical tradition is known as the 8th day. Or it is only after the coming of the last day of this new week that the true revelation of Jesus, or the true revelation of God, is made. So how does John set this up? Here's the day plan, okay? On the first day, John the Baptist gives testimony to the leadership in Jerusalem about his mission. On the second day, John gives testimony to Jesus' baptism. On the third day, and on the second day, Jesus had come, and John had proclaimed famous words that we use regularly, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." Again, we emphasize that here the phrase is the sin, not the sins, although most of our tradition later on will add the S. And if you think about it, there's a difference between sin, which affects everything and across the board, and sins, which are particular or individual actions. And so that, of course, is another discussion that takes place. On the third day, Jesus again passes by, and two disciples of John are there, and John suggests to them that they check Jesus out. They do. As they're going along, John pictures Jesus as turning around and saying to these two disciples, "What is it that you're looking for?" And they say to him, "Well, where do you live?" And Jesus says, "Come and see." And on that day, they spend some time with Jesus. And one of those two disciples who come to Jesus is named Andrew. He goes and gets his brother Peter, brings his brother Peter to Jesus and says, "This, I believe, is the Messiah." On the fourth day, now the scene shifts. We're not quite sure how they get there or where they get there, but there is the episode in which Jesus is presented by his friend Philip, brings a gospel messenger or a member to meet with him, and he is called Nathanael. And Nathanael says, "Well, can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Jesus, and again the phrase "come and see." So all of that, and he brings this disciple, and there's a whole story there, which involves the third day. Now, how do we get? And then it says, or the fourth day that would be, and then 3 days later. Now, if you take 4, you have 5, 6, and 7. On the 7th day, they arrive at Cana. Now, that's just one viewpoint here. Many point out that the Johannine Gospel is very indebted to the Hebrew story, a remembrance of Israel's history, and that many of the members of the Johannine community had grown up in Judaism and still believed in Judaism, but had embraced Jesus as the Messiah and as the Savior. So, argument goes on now. What, as this little reading that we'll hear this time, on the third day? Well, of course, one needs to move this story right to the very end. On the third day is also a reference to the resurrection of Jesus that we will find there. A lot of viewpoints about the Johannine Gospel here, coming to, and this is the story that we hear, Jesus is called or comes to a wedding. Now, the wedding feast of Cana. There's, of course, a great deal of discussion about this. And again, it depends somewhat upon the interpretation. One of the more traditional is that this wedding feast at Cana, well, in which the mother of Jesus is invited, is present, and also apparently Jesus. Now, we're not quite sure how Jesus got the invitation. Keep in mind at this point in the Johannine tradition, we know only of 4 really possible disciples of Jesus. So when it says that Jesus and his disciples were there, our imagination pictures that all 12 were there, but again, that isn't mentioned. And really in the story of Jesus' ministry, would he have already had a full complement of 12 disciples or 12 apostles at this point? So someone has analyzed this story a little bit, asking these questions about what we're not told. Who called and invited both the mother of Jesus and Jesus to the wedding? Were they members of the bride of the bride's family who invited these Jesus and Mary? And please notice that Mary is not named here. She is named as the mother of Jesus, but not given a specific name. Were they invited by the groom's family? Did the mother of Jesus ask that the disciples be included in the invitation to the wedding? And as I mentioned, how many disciples did Jesus actually have at this time? Now, we do know, and this would be the more traditional understanding, that weddings were considered to be communal events. And if indeed it took place in Cana, Cana probably at this time would not have been a huge would not have had a huge population, would have been a village, and well could be that the whole village in some way took part in this wedding celebration. Again, Cana will turn out to be in the Johannine tradition an interesting place. It is mentioned really only in the Johannine tradition. Weddings, well, if you had a wedding, if you were going to have a wedding, then there would have been, of course, a great deal of preparation that took place, even if this were considered to be a communal event. So, for example, the food that you would serve would be different. The regular diet would probably have been, in a place like Cana, fish, vegetables, olives, cheese, and wine. But if this is a grand occasion, like a wedding, well, then the meat would have been either from sheep or even from a well-fed calf that they had kind of raised and kept for this occasion. So when one thinks about it, it was a grand occasion, and a grand occasion, I would say, not only for the family of the bride and groom, and we've talked before about how that whole situation moved forward, that the groom had spent sufficient time preparing for where he and his wife-to-be were going to live. We're not sure that they lived, but we suspect that they lived in Cana, but that again is just kind of filling in the blank. So there's a lot that goes on in this story that we don't know about now. The mother of Jesus is there, and Jesus is there, and you're familiar, I'm sure, with the story. As it unfolds, it seems that the wine, now granted that they were preparing, and where suddenly there becomes a need for more wine. We do know that wedding celebrations often extended over roughly about a week's time, so you could see that people were feeling pretty good when you came to the 4th and 5th days, particularly if they had been eating and drinking. But again, if they were villagers, they often went home. So you see there's a lot of kind of understanding of what the customs and culture of the time were all about. Anyway, at this wedding, the wine apparently is beginning to run out, and the mother of Jesus says to Jesus, they have no wine. Their wine is is in short supply. Jesus' response, and we'll look at this in a little bit of detail, is kind of cryptic. Jesus is pictured as saying to his mother, well, what concern is that to you and to me? Now again, it might be the tone in which this was said, Mom, is this any of our concern? Or it could have been a little rougher, Mother, is this any of our concern? Implication being they should have been more prepared for this in the first place, so why make their problem our problem? And in some ways, you can see that Jesus' response to his mother is considered to be kind of impolite, and he doesn't call her mother, calls her woman. It is a term that is used in this gospel only twice. Here at Cana, and then later on at the foot of the cross. Jesus will also use this term when referring to Mary, who is standing at the foot of the cross, woman, behold your son. So some will make a discussion about the interesting title woman, which at one way, if we used it today, would probably sound kind of, not particular. Try calling your mother woman and see how you get with that one. So today it would be kind of considered not insulting, but certainly not very honorable. However, in the way in which the gospel writer John phrases things, that would not be the case. So Mary is pictured when Jesus says this to her, says to the steward or to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Now, some have pointed out that phrase on the part of Mary to the steward is an example, the first example in the tradition of John, of someone who has faith and trust in the ability of Jesus to do things. She doesn't obviously say what should be done, but the fact that by these words, John indicates here truly a woman of faith, and that would be applicable to the fact that this woman is the mother of Jesus and is Mary. Now also some say, although you have to be a little bit Hebrew in this one, that when Jesus says to his mother, what concern is this to you and to me, is a typical way in which Jewish thinkers often engaged in kind of reflection, that a question is posed by someone and then the hearer responds to it by asking another question. And that out of that kind of discussion comes learning. Now, if that's what John has in mind, that there's a kind of learning experience going on between Jesus and Mary, well, that would be another possible interpretation, and could be based on the fact that arguing in this sense is something pleasurable. It's a sign of intimacy that Jesus could only say to his mother this response if indeed there was a familiarity and a kind of closeness that existed between her and him. We have spoken on a couple of other occasions about the fact that the firstborn son had also often been raised by the mother, that there was a close bond between the mother and the child. And that may be the situation here, that there had been a close bond between his mother and Jesus. So this is a friendly argument and is a means of being sociable. They are really speaking in public and are kind of setting the stage for what is going to happen. Jesus' response to his mother was, my hour has not yet come. Now again, in looking at the Johannine Gospel, we have noticed on other occasions that this is one of the key terms that helps develop the story of Jesus by by the fourth gospel writer, namely the hour of Jesus. Now, the hour of Jesus, ultimately, you remember in this gospel, comes at Calvary, when Jesus is truly revealed as the divine Son of God, as the servant of the Father. But my hour has not yet come. But has the hour begun when Jesus does the sign that follows? So again, there is discussion in the Johannine tradition as to the exact timing of the hour, but do not think of hour necessarily as something ticked off on the clock, but as a moment or a period or an action in life. So, all of that, again, a little bit of background as to what happens when Mary tells Jesus that they are in trouble. Now, just to finish this up, Mary does not, as some authors will say, so much ask a question or make a demand, but I like this term, offers an indirect request. The mother, therefore, when she says something that is Mary to Jesus, expects that he's going to do something. So she's not telling him to do something. That's why it's called, I like this phrase, an indirect request. How you do that, well, you can hear. But there would be put together all that we've been talking about here, this intimacy, this closeness, this relationship that existed between Mary and Jesus. And in a gospel in which relationships are very, very important, one will notice throughout the Johannine tradition that relationships become the key to many of the episodes, and often the relationships are one-on-one. Even here, the dialogue is one-on-one, Jesus with Mary. Now, she says to the steward, do whatever he tells you. All right, so what does Jesus say? He says to, we assume, the man who is in charge of running the wedding feast, fill all of the jars, that is the jars, purification jars, with water. Now, why did they need to be filled? Well, some said why they were empty because everyone before they had engaged in the celebration or the meal had engaged in the ritual purification process and had used the water in those jugs, and so therefore they were empty. All right, so that one explains why they need to be filled with water. Now, how many jars are there? There are 6 stone jars. Now, the fact that they're stone would also mean that they're probably not easily moved, although they could be, we're not sure. But the estimate is that each of these jars would hold from 18 to 24 gallons of water. Well, by any stretch of the imagination, that's a pretty good number if you want ounces or gallons of water. Now, they fill them, as the gospel we hear, to the brim, and then Jesus says to the steward, take a cup or something out of one of those jugs and take it to the bridegroom. And he tastes it, and the steward says to the bridegroom, usually when wedding celebration begins, the best wines are given first, and then when people have, and again, keep in mind, or extending this over, well, maybe not just a period of hours, but a period of days, when people have had a bit much to drink, then you bring in the wine that's of lesser taste or value. And the steward says to the bridegroom, you have kept the best till last. So in other words, there's a reversal of the way in which things were supposed to be done. Now, Again, we get this fulfillment, we get this, remember, we started by saying on the seventh day or after 3 days. Well, all right, so all of that is a little background for this. Who knows how or when this wine, the water had been turned into, came from? Well, when you think about it, really only Jesus and the steward. And you can notice a number of unnamed figures here. We don't know who they were. We don't know what their particular background was. This idea that water could be changed into wine, or that wine was a gift of God and an important remembrance. Keep in mind that if you had the choice, now some of you would say, I'd rather have water than wine, but that would be a few of you. But honoring the gods with wine. Dionysius is honored in the Greek-speaking world with wine. Bacchus in the Roman tradition is the god of wine. So if Jesus, you see, is able to turn water into wine, then some sense of the divinity of Jesus is now being revealed in this action. So, as is the case in this gospel, there are many linkages that he makes. Later on, Jesus will say, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. And what comes out of the vine is what the grapes, and of course, is wine. Now, so all of this are symbolically part of what lies behind this little episode. This John calls the first sign of Jesus. And in this gospel there are, you'll remember, 7 signs or 7 miracles. We have looked at most of them in earlier times. Perhaps this is the first opportunity to look at the first of signs, which deals with here really nature's items, water, wine. It serves and benefits people, but it does not really affect people directly, okay? Yes, if you drink enough, it affects you, but not only in that sense. So, has Jesus' hour come? Is this the first of the great signs of Jesus? Well, in the Johannine Gospel, that's true. And the conclusion, many came to believe in Jesus because of this, although that verse follows. All right, so all of that is why this is a manifestation, a revelation that Jesus is truly the divine Son of God, who has power, in this sense, over nature even. That is, to bring water into wine. So it's a wonderful conclusion, if you want, to the manifestation period. The letter of Paul to the Corinthians was written from when Paul was stationed or spent time at the city of Ephesus, probably about the year 54 of the common time. And the section that we hear this time for our reflection has to do with the response to questions about spiritual gifts or charisms. And Paul's point, as we hear, and perhaps just to kind of conclude here, that no charism is better or superior to someone else's. All are valuable. And then depending on which charism it is, some are gifted with the ability to communicate, apostles, prophets, and teachers. Some are the charism of social service, deacons tending the sick and giving poor alms. Some to executive positions, bishops, shepherds, elders. Each receives their own particular charism, is Paul's point, but none is superior to the other. Each are given in the hopes that they will be of service to one another, that it will be helpful in building and strengthening a community in Corinth. You may know the Corinthians had a difficulty in many cases of getting along, but here Paul wants to point out that charisms are given not for the personal mark of privilege, or prestige, but are given for the benefit and sake of all. So I just thought we would conclude a little bit with Paul's reminding his contemporaries of the importance of the charisms that each was given. May we use ours well in the days to come and drink always the fullness of God's graciousness and goodness. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.